Hey everyone, so as you can imagine, these days have been very complicated and filled with emotional ups and downs, joy from seeing hostages return and go back to their loved ones, and heartbreak from, terror attacks and lost soldiers. And sometimes it's this roller coaster of up and down all the time. And it seems so fitting that these weeks we're studying the Torah portions of the life of Joseph, because his life seems to have similarly been a roller coaster. Like, things are going great, he's the beloved son, and then he's at the bottom, sold to Egypt, and he rises from being a slave to being the respected caretaker of the house of Potiphar, only to be thrown in prison. But then there's hope. He makes friends, and maybe they can help him and speak to Pharaoh on his behalf, but then they forget about him. And then they remember him, and he becomes second to Pharaoh, only at the end to have his brothers still suspect him. He's on this constant up and down of, peaks and valleys, and you wonder, how does Yosef maintain his emunah, his faith, and his equilibrium in the face of everything that happens to him? When I try to understand his real message to us, I think it's distilled when he's able to look back at what's happened to him, and he doesn't, talk all that much, but when he does, it's so meaningful. And he says to his brothers in chapter 45, verse 5, he says, "But now do not be sad, and let it not trouble you that you sold me here, for it was to preserve life that God sent me before you." But they don't even really internalize it. They still think maybe deep down he's angry. And in Bereshit 50, in Genesis 50, he says, "Don't be afraid. Am I instead of God?" He says, "Atachat Elokim anochi ani." He says, I'm not the planner here. I'm not Hashem. I am just moving in Hashem's plan. And he says, "Indeed, you intended evil against me, but God designed it for good in order to bring about what is at present, to keep a great populace alive." So you guys might have thought that you were hurting me, but it was really for me to save all of these people from the famine. There was a good ending to all of this. So if there's this one message that Yosef teaches us, and he didn't just teach, he practiced what he preached throughout his life, is to live without fear and sadness from the knowledge of the fact that even the hard and the bad seeming events are part of a larger plan. And Yosef implores us to try to put whatever challenges or suffering we face into a broader perspective of how Hashem is moving us and moving the world forward in a grander redemptive process that you might not be able to see with your natural eyes. So, in the beginning of the war, the first ideas that I felt guided to explore were trying to understand the meaning of Hamas in the Torah. Because obviously Hamas didn't do market research and try to use a biblical word for evil. They think they're the heroes, not the Hebrew meaning of Hamas. But it just seems so strange to me that the word Hamas in Hebrew would be the culmination of all evil that we see in the portion of Noach that leads to the flood. The fact that they chose that Arabic acronym, that had to have been planted there by Hashem in order to guide us and give us a sense of what we're up against. And, the idea was that, and sort of just know this intuitively, that people reveal their true selves without even meaning to. And so if they chose Hamas as their name, that has to be a sign of their inner intention and essence. And that's, a deep life lesson in general, because so often we see people around us and, as the way we want to see them. But when you actually listen, a lot of times people will tell you what they really mean and what they really want, and we should listen. And what I didn't realize at the beginning of the war, because I was so involved in our Jewish-Israeli perspective, was that Hamas doesn't just reveal who they are through their name, but also through what they're calling this particular action. They're calling this war the Al-Aqsa flood, the flood of the Temple Mount. Now that's really interesting for a few reasons. First of all, because the first time we see the word Hamas in the Torah is in the context of the flood. That hardly seems like a coincidence. And what was the flood essentially? When we think back to the flood in the times of Noach, it was the idea of sending the world back into chaos, because the world started as tohu vavohu, this chaotic, watery mess that Hashem made into creation. And little by little, all the first chapters of the Torah are like the world standing up on its wobbly little legs and starting to make process. We hear about agriculture and shepherding and music and cities. And then the flood came. It essentially rewinded all of that and set everything back to chaos. So when someone tells you that they want to make a flood, believe them. They are revealing to us their deepest purpose and existence, to take a world that has made progress. We have technology, prosperity, science, economy, and turn it back, rewind a flood onto it. Now, why does that matter? I mean, maybe it doesn't matter, but maybe our enemies are doing the heavy lifting for us by showing us how they fit into a larger scheme of things. What do they mean to do? Maybe without even intending to reveal that to us. Now it's interesting, there's only one other time in the whole Bible where the word Mabul, flood, appears, and that's in Psalm 29. It says that Hashem sat enthroned at the flood. Hashem sat as king forever. And the translation often appears like it's in past tense, but the Hebrew actually seems to be future tense. In relation to a flood, Hashem will be king forever, meaning that Hashem's eventual recognition as king of the world will come in some sort of context relating to a flood. And I was thinking, wow, that's strange and interesting. And then I stumbled across a passage in the writings of Rav Sadia Gaon, who lived in the 9th century. He says something so strange in his writings about what's going to take place in future days. And he says that the eventual redemption will come through a flood that is not really a flood. He says there's going to be a flood at the time of redemption, but it's not an actual flood of water, because Hashem promised that at the time of Noah not to ever bring another actual flood to destroy the world. That's sort of a funny thing to say, because if you're going to say there's going to be a flood, then say that there's going to be a flood. If it's not going to be a flood, then say there's not going to be a flood. There's going to be something else. What is the meaning of a flood that's not an actual real flood? And so there's something else that's going to flood the world, and later interpretations in the mystical writings try to figure this out. Maybe it means a flood of confusion or a flood of disbelief. How interesting that the Hamas themselves, of all things, actually call this war a flood. They're saying to us, we are Hamas, we are trying to bring a flood. It's exactly what the mystical tradition is telling us will be, and exactly what the Psalms hints will be in relation to the development of the world into a recognition and consciousness of godliness. And so we have Hamas and we have flood. Now, why would they call it the Al-Aqsa flood? Al-Aqsa is the Temple Mount. What is the Temple Mount? Seemingly, the war had nothing to do with the Temple Mount. The attack that happened on October 7th wasn't anywhere near the Temple Mount, and the retaliation was nowhere near the Temple Mount either. It's imagining like a war between Ukraine and Russia called the Australian War. What's the connection, and why a flood? It didn't start in the winter. It wasn't a rainy time. The sun was shining on October 7th when the war started. They could have called it a war of firebombs from Al-Aqsa, the explosion, anything manly sounding. Why a flood? What's the connection? They're telling us, and we only have to listen. What is the Temple Mount? The Temple Mount symbolizes the final correction of the world, the redemption, the pinnacle of spiritual achievement. They're saying we are here to flood that, to set that back, to create chaos, where you would want to build the height and pinnacle of holiness, purity, connection with Hashem. We are coming to turn that back into flood. And that, of course, sent me looking to the book of Zechariah, because the imagery of a flood from Jerusalem, that's like a big flashing sign to Zechariah chapter 14, where it says, and it shall come to pass that on that day a spring water, it says in the English, but it actually says in the Hebrew, living water shall come forth from Jerusalem, half of it to the eastern sea, half of it to the western sea. In the summer and winter it shall be. And the Lord shall be king over all of the earth on that day. The Lord shall be one, and his name one. Like, our enemies aren't wrong. They're intuiting something deep. There is supposed to be a flood of sorts from Har Habayit, from the Temple Mount, but not a flood that brings death like the first flood, or like the flood of Hamas. It says specifically in the Hebrew, living water will burst forth from Jerusalem and create a river that goes from one sea to the other. We hear people chanting from the river to the sea. There's going to be a river to the sea. They are saying to us, or maybe Hashem is saying to us through them, through their choices of words, like, zoom out of the current moment and see that what is happening is not just a random, isolated episode, but it's part of a much larger process. And, the next verse says that the Lord shall become king over the earth. On that day, Hashem will be one, and his name will be one. What's interesting is that if you just, flip a few pages back to chapter 9, it talks about that time where Hashem will be king and Mashiach will arrive. And what is our vision of that? What is the vision that the prophets of Israel set forward for that time? Look how it contrasts with the vision that our enemies portray. It says, I will cut off the chariots from Ephraim and the horses from Jerusalem, meaning, and the bow of war shall be cut off. And there won't be any more tools of killing and of fighting. It says that Mashiach will come and he shall speak peace to the nations. And his rule, now listen to this imagery carefully, shall be from the sea in the west and from the river to the ends of the earth. The biblical vision of redemption compared to the Hamas vision of redemption, when they say Al-Aqsa flood, they mean a metaphoric flood of killing, blood, violence. When the prophets of Israel think of Geula, when they think of redemption, they describe Mashiach that brings peace to all of the nations. Now, of all the ways that the prophets of Israel could have described this peace, listen to the words that are chosen. It says, miyam liyam, from water to water. What is that? What do you imagine when one body of water meets the other body of water? That's like the definition of a flood, of water springing forth, right? That imagery is coming to say there will be a flood, but it's not a flood. It's going to be a flood of peace. In the place that you thought you were going to bring a flood of suffering and pain and killing, Hashem has the vision of the world that will be a flood of peace. And then the very next verse right after that in Zechariah chapter 9, it says in verse 11, you too with the blood of your covenant, I have freed your prisoners from a pit in which there was no water. Now it's really interesting that in this context, that it's talking about this time where there's going to be, floods of living water and floods of peace. Around that time, they're going to be prisoners freed from pits under the ground. Now think back, like the ability to dig really deep pits was probably fairly limited in ancient times. People were able to dig wells and cisterns to gather water, but like pits that you could live in, I mean, it was probably possible in the ancient world, but not extraordinarily common. And the interpreters here don't even have a vision of people actually physically being held underground. So they say, oh, it's like the pit here is a metaphor for being in the exile or from spiritual darkness. Here we're actually living in times where we see people being freed from underground pits, exactly like the verse says. And the Hebrew is really interesting here because it says that they don't have water in them. These are going to be pits that are characterized with not having water, which is kind of interesting and even funny. Like we just read yesterday in the newspapers that Israel is considering flooding the tunnels with seawater. It's like, the verse almost seems like wink, wink. It's tunnels, pits in the ground that have no water. Maybe they could be using some water right about now, but the words are like a giant flashing sign to where, when we think of a pit that has no water, there actually is that term somewhere else. And this brings us back full circle to Yosef. When Yosef was thrown in the pit, it actually says his brothers threw him in a pit that was empty and had no water. It's like flashing sign. You're going to be in a time where you're going to need to draw strength from this Yosef perspective, from this calm and emunah that comes from the knowledge that even your darkest times, like Yosef exemplified in his own life of being down in the pits and being, and fighting against, so many dark, evil forces, that in his life he was able to walk around with this knowledge that it's part of Hashem's larger plan to bring about something good and a salvation and a geula. And so it's like a perfect time for us to draw our strength, especially during these parshas and during these parshas of life and these parshas in the Torah, draw strength from that Yosef perspective and take that with us to help us make it through these days with less sadness, less fear, and with more faith that Hashem will lead us in the end to the final geula that he plans for us. So with that, I wish everybody a good week and hope to see you again soon. Bye.